I hope you won't get bored, because I will talk about something we haven't really addressed yesterday, I think, because I'm more concerned about objective effort. So objectively measuring and predicting how many resources people mobilize for doing something. And actually, I never did much research on subjective effort or effort cost. I'm confronted with that now as a reviewer frequently. But what I find interesting connecting points, because I see a lot of clear connecting points, but also a lot of questions I have sometimes if we mix up these two areas. Anyway, so the talk is about effort mobilization, some lessons from the heart. And well, I mean, that's another thing which is a little bit strange, maybe. It's, as Juan Pablo said, I'm studying effort in cognitive tasks, but we measure effort in the heart and not in the brain. And well, why do we do that? I will explain that in a couple of minutes. We have a reason to do that, and the reason is that I think that's the best measure if you want to assess objectively how much resources people mobilize. So to start with some definitions, this talk is about motivation. And motivation can be defined as the direction and energization of behavior. It's a process that determines what we do and how we do it. And effort refers to the intensity or vigor or energization aspect. That is, effort intensity corresponds to the intensity of actual motivation. And well, we have defined that, and it's not our invention, Rex Wright and me, in a chapter about effort that was largely shared among researchers for decades. Nowadays, interestingly, some new researchers in the field have different definitions. We maybe talk about that in the discussion. But for us, effort is a mobilization of resources for instrumental behavior, that is, for goal-directed action. And I can start with a simple example, which will be pretty evident for you, but which is, however, interesting, because that is something people have forgotten for a long time, at least in psychology, when they studied effort. So you have here a nice American campus with 4 buildings. And between classes, people have to move from northeast to southeast and so on. And the question is now, which way do you take? And I think it's pretty evident. It's pretty evident. Everybody would agree that if you go from southeast to northeast, you take this sidewalk, okay? Does anybody disagree? I don't think so. Interesting thing is what's happening if you go from southeast to northwest. And that before this dirt path exists, because this is lawn. Normally it's prohibited on a nice American campus to touch the lawn. But what you can observe at several places is that people, they find a way themselves, which is less costly. And this nicely describes the principle of least effort, which was something which was largely really agreed on in early psychology research between behaviorists and neo-behaviorists like Tolman and Hull. For Tolman, there was a principle of minimal effort, so organisms always choose the easiest way to goal attainment. For Hull, classical behaviorist, so when goals didn't exist, he was more interested in reinforcement, and he calls it the law of minimal work. So if there are multiple habits that guide to reinforcer, organisms seek and choose the easiest one. And even in German cognitive will psychologist, same agreement, completely different school, but the difficulty law of motivation by Nazis Ach. Once a person commits to a goal, the intensity of motivation, which is effort, rises with the difficulty of goal attainment. The question is why? Well, yesterday we have started this discussion about the valence of effort, and we have seen already some effort phases. I present you something else. So this is something which is maybe more important to most of us than lifting weights, what we saw yesterday. It's opening a bottle of wine. And what you can see is what you have seen yesterday. So we have a very strong corrugator response, the effort phase. And what happens if you have accomplished your goal? Relief. And in this condition, no corrugator anymore, it's relaxed, but you see a nice corrugator activation. So the phase changes, and the funny thing is with this physical effort task, the phase doesn't help you at all to open the bottle. So why do we do that? It's maybe a point we can continue in the discussion. But in emotion psychology, also some researchers like Craig Smith, they found in appraisal research that in general, effort mobilization is experienced as unpleasant. But my point is that does not mean that we are lazy and that we avoid effort. I think that's a misunderstanding. The important point, if you take this, is that we want to avoid to mobilize more effort than necessary. That is, so we want to conserve resources, but it's not the case that we avoid resources. And sometimes you can read that even in recent publications that people are motivated to avoid effort. I don't think so. At least the school I come from, had the idea that is more something like maybe motivational intelligence, that people seem to be constructed in a way that we do the necessary, but not more. But we are absolutely willing to do the necessary. That's an important point. Okay, and this leads us to motivation intensity theory. After these early days of experimental psychology, in psychology, people were no longer so interested in effort. So some took a link with incentive, with punishment and rewards, but there was something like a big silence on this phenomenon. And in motivation psychology, people were more interested in what people do. So how needs influence our behavior, the direction. But the intensity, the how aspect was a long time not really studied. That's why I'm very happy that nowadays there's a lot of research, even though I don't agree with most of that, but that's also something we can discuss in the end. Motivation intensity theory was something like a revival of effort research. It's a theory by Jack Brehm, who was a very well-known social psychologist in the 80s because he developed reactance theory. He was somebody of the first person studying dissonance theory, and he became interested in predicting how goal value is determined. And his idea was goal value, the subjective value or valence of what we can get out of our actions, is directly determined by the amount of resources we mobilize to do that. And the general idea behind that was that behavior is governed by the principle of resource conservation. That means not effort avoidance. That means you are willing to do the necessary, but you avoid to do more. That's all. And the theory is very simple. It's a very, very simple and elegant, but also very precise theory. It's something like a model for a theory in psychology, I think, because you rarely find that it's something really as precise as this. The idea is that effort corresponds to the level of subjective demand. So effort rises with subjective demand as long, and this is important, as it's possible to do the necessary, and as long as the necessary effort is justified. And this possibility to cope variable that depends on subjective difficulty. And this justification aspect depends on the importance of success. And that is something Brehm called potential motivation. So he made a distinction between actual motivation, which is vigor or effort, intensity of emotion, of motivation, in a moment, and potential motivation, which is simply what we are potentially willing to do, the upper limit of the resources we are willing to invest. And this is directly determined by the importance of success and determines this maximally justified amount of effort. And for Brehm, he was not really interested in effort itself. He was more interested in goal value. The consequence of effort intensity, which is determined by this principle, you mobilize that is necessary according to difficulty, as long as it's possible and justified to do it, should directly determine the value, the subjective value of your goals. Okay, and another tiny aspect, which is not so important for today, potential motivation can, under one condition, so things like importance of success, which can be determined by incentives, monetary incentives, for instance, they can, under this variable can, under one condition, directly determine effort intensity, and that is when we don't have any idea about difficulty. But that's the only one. As soon as we have an idea, even if it's a wrong one, we will just orient our effort mobilization on the subjective level of demand, always to comply with the principle of resource conservation, that we are willing to do the necessary and justified, but not more. Graphically, this theory is pretty simple, but also, I repeat, is pretty precise, so much more precise than most other theories in psychology. So you have task difficulty, and you have here effort as a dependent variable, and the red line. So effort rises with difficulty up to the point where the maximum of justified effort is attained, and or difficulty is so extreme that we cannot cope with it, and so we should disengage. The idea of the theory is also, if one of these two limits is attained, so if we have to mobilize more than justified, or if we cannot mobilize the necessary, we should immediately disengage, because otherwise we would just violate the principle of resource conservation. The important point of this theory is, well, what happens if you do something which is really important for you, when you are willing to invest a lot of resources, but the task is easy? And that is something a lot of people were not understanding at the beginning. The prediction is, if you do something which can be really extremely important, but if it's easy, you only mobilize very, very, very low resources. And you only mobilize more if more has to be mobilized, up to this certain point where you reach the level of what is maximally justified, or what is the point where things become impossible for you. And this level of potential motivation, the importance of success, the level of justified effort, that can vary. I'll give you some examples later. The principle is always the same. So even if you do something which is completely unimportant for you, so a very low level of potential motivation, you're willing to invest very, very, very little resources, you always mobilize effort according to experience demand, but the maximum level, of course, is lower. Well, what does it mean? You can just derivate from that only if a task is difficult and important, you mobilize a lot of resources. If a task is important but not difficult, you don't. And if a task is unimportant, you will always mobilize relatively low resources because more is simply not justified. And only under the condition that you have no idea about difficulty, so this is this red bar, effort corresponds directly to what is justified. Okay, so we have now the definition of the concept, effort, mobilization of resources. We have a theory, which is very elegant and parsimonious and predicts with two variables how effort should be mobilized. The question is now, how can we measure it? And as I said, I mean, I'm interested in the heart and not so interested in the brain, actually, as the organ in the body that should reflect the objective mobilization of resources. And I will explain you now why that. So in psychophysiology, people did a lot of research in the 60s, 70s on cardiovascular responses to stress, and also in learning experiment, in learned helplessness experiments. So Paul Obrist, he was a very, very important psychophysiologist. He did a lot of research with dogs. And he discovered, I mean, in conditioning research, that under some conditions, the dogs, they showed an increase in heart rate when they expected a shock, and other dogs didn't. And he figured out that it's related to the control the dog can have to avoid the shock. If the dog has control and can act, so he can actively avoid, he is stressed. He shows a heart rate response if the shock is announced by an conditioned stimulus. However, if the dog has no way to do it, there's no heart rate response. The shock is the same, and even if you deliver the shock, the dog knows, I mean, that will be painful. They just stay calm. The question is why? Well, according to Obrist, that's because the dog who can control the outcomes of his action or control what will happen to him, he is in a condition of active coping. So he can actively determine what will happen. And for Obrist, it's even more specific. In the cardiovascular system, whenever you have control over what's going on with you, there's task engagement, which is more or less the same in effort, which is directly mirrored by beta-adrenergic sympathetic nervous system impact on the heart. So that's very physiological. But for those who are not really in the psychophysiology, you will know the sympathetic nervous system is our mobilization system. It makes your heart beating faster, it makes you breathing faster, and all these things. And the parasympathetic nervous system is your rest down and digest system. It makes conceptually perfect sense if we define effort as the mobilization of resources to look for a measure that can really reliably reflect this. And according to the research by Obrist, the sympathetic nervous system impact on the heart seems to be able to do this. And Rex Wright, my friend and colleague, a student of Brehm, he just integrated this physiological approach with Brehm's effort theory, and he came up with the operationalization of effort, that beta-adrenergic impact that determines a measure which is pre-ejection period is proportional to subjective task demand as long as success is possible and justified. And now we have nearly everything. We have a definition of the concept, we have an operationalization of the concept in terms of this measure, and we have a theory that predicts what's going on, and we can soon start to look if it works. I will just take 1 minute to explain you a little bit better what pre-ejection period is, as this measure, which is very sensitive of this sympathetic, so this activation system impact on our body. What we do is we put electrodes on people's torso, and you measure two things. You measure an ECG. You will know that everybody will have done an ECG as a medical medical test, I think, which gives you information about what's going on with the depolarization and polarization of the muscle fibers in the heart, the electrical system, which lets the fibers contract. And parallelly, we measure the change of impedance in the body. That is simply that when blood goes into the torso, impedance goes down. If there's less blood, impedance goes up. You can imagine also take a tap, an electrode at top, an electrode at bottom. You put some current through this and you fill it with water, you empty it with water. And what you will find is that the impedance, the electrical resistance changes when there's water in. It's lower than there's water out. Impedance is always presented inverted. That means, so if the values here in the ICG, which is the first derivative of the change in impedance, electrical resistance is down, this value goes up. Anyway, so what you measure is you measure two things. You measure something which is called the B point. This is here. This is the moment where the aortic valve opens and lets the blood out into the body. And you measure another thing in the ECG, you measure the beginning of the electrical stimulation of the muscle fibers to contract. What you want to do is a cardiac contractile force index. And the time between the beginning of the contraction and the moment when the blood gets out, this is his famous pre-ejection period. And this is the most reliable, the most sensitive, non-invasive measure of sympathetic impact we can take in the body. It's not so complex to measure it nowadays. Well, some decades ago, it was a hassle, but that's what we do to measure effort. Another measure which is very suitable is systolic blood pressure. So the pressure peak in your vasculature. That makes sense because when the heart contracts strongly, more blood is let out and the pressure in the system gets up. Well, physiologically, that's maybe interesting. I mean, all these tiny things here in this 1 second, that's what's happening in one heartbeat. It's amazing. I always, when I see this, I think, I mean, I know why I study the heart. There's so much going on. The brain is really boring if you compare that. You know, there's only some electrical stimulation and all. But here, I mean, that's also on the physical side. A lot of things happen. It's a machine which is incredible. Pre-ejection period in this timeline is this tiny period from here to here when the aortic valve opens. And you can see once the valve is opened, systolic pressure goes up. And therefore, a lot of researchers also take measures of systolic blood pressure, but it's noisier because blood pressure is not only determined by contractility force, which has an impact on the measure which is called cardiac output, the amount of blood that is pumped into the system. It also depends on vascular resistance, and that is not so clearly influenced by sympathetic arousal. Well, that was pretty technical until here. But what I wanted to show you is something which comes from my school of thought. It was not me who invented it, but I'm coming from a very Popperian tradition. So I was educated, if you find something interesting, define it and explain it and look for a measure which is on the operational level. So the most closely related to what you want to measure, because psychology is really actually a pretty difficult business. We want to study things that do not exist in the physical world, like emotion, motivation, effort, memory, cognition. You can't touch that. And we want, however, objectively measure it. And what we do is we measure the physical world to conclude something on this metaphysical world. And that is tricky business because we always have this conceptual and operational gap between the things. In physics, you can resolve this. In neuroscience, you can resolve this because you can rest in the physical world. Psychologists can't. And philosophers are more in the, I call it maybe metaphysical, but we want to connect these things. That's why psychology exists, because we wanted to connect these two things, which is not easy. Anyway, so let's see now if that works. And if people really only mobilize the necessary as long as that is possible and justified. I will first show you some effects of difficulty, so the extent of demand on cardiovascular measures of effort. And that was an experiment we did, which is pretty simple. There were just 4 conditions of a memory task, a Sternberg shorter memory task. And in the shorter memory task, stimuli were presented pretty long, 1 second, half a second. It's a little bit more difficult, but still very long. 100, there things become tricky, but still possible, or 50 milliseconds, so it's impossible. You just see a flicker on the screen. That's 1 frame at this time with a computer screen we used, and you don't see anything. So you can't decide if a stimulus that is presented is a yes, correct stimulus, or a no, incorrect trial. We have here the changes in pre-ejection period. Pre-ejection period is measured in milliseconds, and the shorter it is, the stronger is the contractile force of the heart. So the stronger is the sympathetic impact, the higher is effort. And you see that it's very sensitive. These are just tiny, very tiny manipulations of the presentation time of memory stimuli, and you see if it's very easy, nothing happens nearly. If it's a little bit more difficult, more effort. Pre-ejection period becomes closer. When it's really difficult but possible, even still closer. And if it's impossible, nothing, no effort. Very sensitive. If you look in parallel on systolic blood pressure, well, statistically, the overall pattern is the same. But you can also see that there's more noise because, I mean, here with pre-ejection period, all conditions differ significantly from another. The pattern with systolic blood pressure is also fine, but these conditions and these conditions don't differ. Those do, those do. So physiologically, it makes perfect sense because you have much more noise in it. It's not the pure beta-adrenergic sympathetic impact. Anyway, so you can see that if you manipulate difficulty, your heart responds, and very sensitively. We can now see at some other psychological variables that influence demand and potential motivation. And that's where psychology really becomes interesting, because we can see if things like feelings, like personality characteristics, depressive symptoms, and all this can have an impact on that, and how. And they can. If you just apply this logic of motivation intensity theory, that effort rises with demand as long as the necessary effort is justified and as long as it's possible, you can simply look at which psychological variables have an effect on the justified level of effort and which should have an effect on subjective demand. And then you can perfectly predict what's going on. And that's what a lot of people around me and in other labs did. Performance standards, so you can just define accomplish this or more or less, has a very sensitive effect on effort. Ability is a strong moderator. We will come back to that in a couple of minutes at the end of the talk when I look more profoundly at affective influences. But for the same performance level, somebody with low ability has to mobilize more effort than somebody with high ability. And the interesting point is that's not only applying to objective ability differences, it's also sufficient to have subjective beliefs about ability to have this impact. That means people with low ability, they mobilize higher effort than high ability people when a task is easy because they think it's more difficult, but they disengage earlier when things become hard because for them it's over challenging, while somebody with high ability thinks it's feasible but hard, so high effort is what it's called for. Fatigue, same effect, it makes things simply more difficult. Moods, I can show you that at the end, but if you feel happy, things are easier and you tend to mobilize less effort if the task is not objectively hard. Depressive symptoms. People with depressive symptoms are not at all lazy. They mobilize more effort than non-depressed when the task is easy, but when the task becomes difficult, they disengage earlier. Extroversion, personality characteristics, same thing. Extroverts think things are easier with the same effect. Implicit affect, so you can also simply remind people on affective states, not necessarily to let them feel them. I can show you that by simply flashing emotional expressions during tasks that can systematically influence difficulty and effort. Pain, Nicola Silvestrini from our lab. Physical pain with manipulations, with thermostimulation, so really felt pain. Individual differences in chronic pain, and also only priming pain, so reminding people of pain. Same effect, makes a given task more difficult. Implementation intentions, planning your actions, that helps and makes it easier. So if you prepare the action well with an if-then plan, if this happens, I will do that, you will stay engaged when things are really hard because you think it's hard but feasible. While people without this planning, they disengage earlier. And another measure recently discovered, cognitive flexibility. People who are more flexible and less stubborn, it's the use of their cognitive strategies. They also think whatever you do is easier. And aging, as biological aging, but also implicit aging. So you can compare old or elderly and younger people. The elderly for cognitive tasks, they have to mobilize more effort for a given difficulty level than the younger. But you can also let people age implicitly. We did some research on that, and we primed people during cognitive tasks with pictures of elderly people, and they mobilize more effort if the task is easy, and they disengage earlier when the task is difficult. So it seems also to have a very systematic impact on effort via influencing subjective demand. Another example on the effect of the justification of effort, so potential motivation. There we did an experiment where participants had to work on a memory task. They got lists of memory series, which were easy, only few items to memorize within 5 minutes, moderate, difficult, or do your best condition that is unfixed. You can just work on your own pace. And half of these participants who were students were in a condition which is called ego involvement. So there we explained that we were testing their memory abilities under time pressure, and that their performance would be a significant and well-studied predictor of their success as a student. So how well you perform on this task can predict your diploma. Well, 2006 it was still allowed. I'm not sure if that would pass the ethical committees today, but I mean, nobody cried or something. It was not so hard, but it was something which can people really put into a situation that the thing, it's really a good idea to mobilize effort. It's the same if you tell somebody this is an intelligence test. Nobody wants to appear dull. So when you tell that to students, they will always apply themselves very, very, very much because they want to just manage their impression on others. The other half were in a control condition, and there we just said it's a filler task. So we have one condition, a lot of effort is justified, ego involvement. We say this predicts your success as a student in the future, what you will perform, or low. And we have different levels of difficulty. In this study, we only assess systolic blood pressure because we didn't have the impedance monitor at this time. You have in light gray, low ego involvement, so the filler task. And you can see that effort is in all conditions relatively modest. There's a little bit variance, but it's not significant because only little effort is justified. It's just a filler task without any signification for you. However, in the dark gray bars condition, there you have this ego involvement. And there people think it's a good idea to mobilize a lot of effort because then I know if I will be a successful student or not if I succeed. And you can see that effort rises with difficulty from easy to moderate to difficult. And under the condition that people unfixed can do what they want, they mobilize also higher effort when they are ego involved. So when the task is a significant predictor for their life, then if it's not. And that perfectly corresponds to this graphic of the theoretical prediction I presented to you at the beginning of motivation intensity theory. And this is only one example how potential motivation, so the level of justified effort, can have an effect on effort mobilization. There are much more which were studied. So monetary incentive works very well. If you promise a high reward for succeeding, people are willing to invest more for difficult tasks. And otherwise, they are only willing in general to invest a little bit, relatively little effort. Instrumentality, so if you say, if you succeed here, there is a high or low probability to get something else. Like, I don't know, if you say, okay, if you succeed on this task, you get a 90% probability that you get a drink of water, and beforehand you manipulate the level of thirst. Wright did these things. That also makes the task more important, and people are willing to mobilize high effort if the task is difficult. If the same task is easy, no, they don't. Ego involvement we've just seen. Objective self-awareness, you can justify a lot of effort by reminding people on their mere existence. So if you want to work harder, put a mirror on your desk or a photo of yourself that can put you in a state of self-evaluation and justify your effort. That's very replicated. Social evaluation, explicit social evaluation, that's not surprising. If you say this is a test or I'm really evaluating what you do, but also mere social presence has the same effect. If you sit as an experimenter next to a participant without saying or doing something, just being there, they mobilize high effort if the task is difficult. But if the task is easy, they do not. And people who are alone for the same task, they only mobilize always relatively low effort, because social presence can also put you in an evaluation state which justifies higher effort. Hedonic incentive, we did also some studies years ago on affect regulation. So when people can feel better after the task because you predict, you just promise them, if you succeed, you can see a funny movie, compared to a condition where you say, okay, if you succeed, you will really have to watch a disgusting movie. If you can watch the movie that brings you something good for your well-being, you mobilize more effort. If the task is difficult, if the same task under the same condition is easy, you don't. Needs. Need states, it's clear. So you can measure needs, physiological needs like thirst and hunger, but also psychological needs like so-called need for achievement, or other needs can also justify high resources, and recently discovered mortality salience. So on the one hand, with self-awareness, you can remind people on their existence, and they are willing to invest a lot of effort because it's a state of self-evaluation. But you can also remind them on their mortality, and they mobilize high resources under the condition that the task is connected with their worldview. It's related to terror management theory, and I can explain you that in some details later because it's not so important for this talk. But as I said at the beginning, I mean, Brehm theory is a really, really nice tool because it's just predicting in general what's going on with effort. And you can just identify a number of psychological variables that will systematically influence the level of subjective difficulty and the level of justified effort. And then you can make pretty exact predictions of what's going on. Do I still have a couple of minutes? Then I can explain you a little bit more on affective influences. That will be short, but that was...
Yeah, take a couple more minutes.
Okay, because that is actually what we are interested in for the last 20 years, I think, well, even more now. Well, with a lot of studies, and we started to do research on the effect on consciously experienced, on felt affective states, especially moods, so relatively long affective states that are more in the background and which have not a real and clear impact on your action, but which can inform if you have to make evaluative judgment. So the idea is that in the context of task performance, conscious mood states, feeling blue or feeling enthusiastic, can have a systematic impact on task difficulty, on experienced subjective task difficulty, and thus on effort mobilization. And as long as success is possible and justified, as long. Being said, let you evaluate a given task as more difficult, resulting in higher effort. When you are in a happy mood, you will evaluate it as easier and you mobilize lower effort, as long as success is justified and possible, because when things become objectively hard, that can flip around. I will show you that in 2 minutes. And after we have done quite some studies on these effects of consciously experienced mood states, I asked myself if it's really necessary to feel a feeling, or if it's sufficient to remind people on that feeling. And that let me develop another second layer theory, which can be implemented into motivation intensity theory or Brehm. It's the Implicit-Affect-Primes-Effort model. And the idea there is that when people are in different emotional states and they have to do mental work like passing an exam, the affective state will have an effect on the experience of difficulty and ease. So when you are happy during the exam will feel easier. When you are sad, it will feel more difficult. When you are fearful, the exam will feel more difficult. But also if you are angry, the exam will feel easier. Why that? Well, anger is a positive emotion in disguise because it's a negative emotion. Its experience is unpleasant, but it's really in disguise because motivationally it functions as any other positive emotion. And the important point for effort is that anger can make things easier because you have the experience to have high coping potential. When you are angry, you think you can cope with an obstacle. If you think that you can't cope with an obstacle, you are sad. If you think maybe it's 50-50, I don't know, it's ambiguous, you are fearful. But if you think, well, there's an obstacle, but I can get around that, you will feel anger. It's shared by nearly all, well, actually all appraisal series of emotion. And the idea now is that when you have made these experiences, I mean, difficulty and ease experience become parts of your mental representations of different emotional states. That is, you build up connections between sadness and difficulty and fear and difficulty, and between happiness and anger and ease. And if that's true, that you learn that, you can activate the ease and difficult concepts in person's memory by reminding them on these emotional states without letting them feel them. You can very briefly flash pictures, emotional expressions like that during cognitive tasks, and systematically influence the accessibility of the difficulty and ease concepts with the result on task demand and correspondingly a result on effort. And that's what we did about the last 15 years nearly. Now with well, a lot of replications and investigating a lot of moderated variables of that works pretty well. The important point is you should always consider task context if you do something like that, because this theory just predicts you the main effect, and the mood behavior model, conscious mood states, also simple main effects. But I always mentioned that this works as long as success is possible and justified. And these are two important moderators, because if you have affective variables like negative mood, pain, depressive symptoms, or fear and sadness primes, so reminders on these states, compared to a positive mood, weak pain, weak or no depressive symptoms, and primes of happiness and anger, that will systematically influence the difficulty experiences you have and the effort, but in the context of a given task. And if the task is objectively easy, things are just as I explained until now. So negative moods, fear and sadness primes, they let the task appear more difficult, resulting in higher effort than positive mood, weak depressive symptoms, and primes of happiness and anger. The interesting thing is now that that can just completely turn around if task difficulty is objectively high. If task difficulty is objectively high, you have two sources of information. You have the affect-related experience of difficulty and the objective level of difficulty, which you know, and together that should sum up. And the result should be that when you're in a negative mood, or if you are depressive, if you experience pain, you should disengage earlier than somebody who has no depressive symptoms, who is in a positive mood, or who's primed with happiness and anger. Because for this group, or these groups for people, the same difficulty level, which is objectively hard, still seems feasible. Compared to those in this group, it's too much. And if it's too much, they disengage. And that results simply in the completely opposite pattern with low effort in this group compared to the other when the task is objectively difficult, but not if it's easy. That's something you should always consider. In most experiments I review on effort, people not always consider these variables. And that can sometimes well, result in some surprising results, which are actually not surprising, because the context change everything. So I think I'm at the end. I would like to finish with a nice quotation by Marcel Proust in English. The heart does not lie. Thank you for your attention.